Okay, now we enter part 6 of the discussion on ancient storm gods of the entire known world at the time, through from India all the way to Ireland, basically, and all in between, and how they all have connections. And though maybe those people don't think they're actually the same god, they're actually, storm god is the storm god, and river god's a river god, sea god is the sea god, Tiamat, and the creature is the creature, and so on. And they all have the same similar stories. Again, this is part 6. If you haven't seen the others before, go to the very end of this, and in the top right hand corner it will go to part 1, the one that comes up. And if it goes to another part, it will be in the left hand corner. And from going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, it is always in the left hand corner, and we'll carry on through the entire series. And we had just talked about Babylonian Marduk and things, and we're going to finish off a little more Babylonian, go into the Canaanites and Phoenician beliefs and stuff as we finish it off here. And we just talked about Nabu, god of wisdom, who is Mercury and is the son of Marduk. And there's also Adad in Akkadian, and Ishkur in Sumerian, and Hadad in American. They're names of the storm god in the Babylonian Assyrian pantheon, so they're the same. Interesting name, Ishkur. Ish is said to have been people or man. Ishi is a girl, and Ish is a man or whatever. And Ishkur, Kur is basically workable or usable lands in any way in Sumerian, and also it relates to mountains, for Kurgal means great mountain, and Gal is great, like Lugal is great man. So when they talk about Lugal Banda and things, is a great man, men of well renowned, like they say in the Bible, things along that nature. All three are usually written by the ideogram dim, and that's where we were at last time. Dim as in Dimuzi, and you get this idea Dimuzi, and just talking about Z and the god of wisdom and the knowing of rebirth, and the idea of Dim and Dimuzi. And he comes out of a tree, and there's a kind of parallel in this in Celtic lore, where he nails himself to a tree to learn the wisdom of runes, and then has a rebirth too situation. So it works very well kind of to each other. The Akkadian god Adad, though, is cognate name and functions with northwest Semitic god Hadad, so Baal Hadad. In Akkadian, Adad is also known as Raman, which means thunderer, and that's cognate with Aramaic Rimmon, which is a byname of the Aramaic Hadad. Raman was formerly incorrectly taken by many scholars to be an independent Babylonian god identified with the Amorite god Hadad, but then they see now that actually that's totally the connections with it, and wouldn't have actually been able to have been anything separate or different. The Sumerian Ishkur appears in the list of gods found at Farah, but was far less importance than the Akkadian Adad later became, probably partly because the storms and rain are scarce in the southern Babylonian area, and agriculture there depends on irrigation instead. Also, the gods Enlil and Nerta had storm god features, which decreased Ishkur's distinctiveness of being the exact thing as it was, as you say, and he sometimes appears as an assistant or the companion of one of the other two, like along with this comes rain and so on and everything, and bringing it, and then he is like a, so he had them come do this. So the Poseidon releases the Kraken, and he does this thing. He causes a big storm or a tidal wave. It's not actually him, it's because of him, but it's from this guy and that type of situation. Also, the Sumerians had a belief, and you can see it in the Bible too, where there was ground table water. They knew they could dig down and get a well very easily, and they realized after the rainy season and it flooded over that these wells came up quite a bit, and so they had a belief that the water came up from below, and to fertilize plants. And that's kind of odd, but it's like if you've ever had a potted plant and it's got that dish below on the bottom, you can actually put water in that dish and it'll suck up into the bottom of it. It won't water the very top surface, but it keeps the under roots at that level done. But see, that would have to be quite a bit up there. So it does do some type, but not a lot. And maybe deep tapping trees and, date palms and things like that could reach down to table water in some fashion, but usually not. But still, there was that belief system that water comes up from the depths, and it talks about it kind of in the Bible that causes a flood, and you could kind of understand that, and I could whenever I was a kid too. We had a back field that had a huge creek running through it. We used to play around this creek all the time, crawdad fish, all kinds of stuff. I remember seeing a fish there one time, black with orange fins, cool. It was like a green terror cichlid, a Texas cichlid, all the way up into the Dallas-Fort Worth area, amazingly, and in a creek, which is just a ditch type form. But and I ran into water moccasins and a few other things. That's different stories. But this place would flood out whenever it rained bad, and especially if it had been raining before. So if you'd had rain before, it would be lifted up, in its levels. And if it rained again, the ground was saturated around it, not too much higher, and it would come up to a certain level. And I remember looking out over the back field, seeing this happen over and over again a lot of times. And I used to go across this field to go to school, so I had to go through this. It was a problem, but they built a giant little bridge that kind of goes right over the, Billy Goat's Grub bridge that goes over the top of it. But when it flooded at a certain point, you couldn't even go out in the field anymore. In fact, it flooded a few times so bad that it took away the bridge and they had to redo it and so on. But you would notice that it would get to a certain point real close to the level of the land around it, like, man, it's all the way full, and the land around it would start getting saturated, and you would see it glistening and stuff, and the next thing you know, it would just all fill up. And it may have even been after the rain stopped. So you could see how the rain kept accruing in other places, pulling down into that river, but to your view appearance here, it's all happening from coming up out of the ground or growing that way. Anyhow, you can kind of see the idea that they had there, and again, it does carry on through the biblical idea of it and everything. So they relied on that type of water and being able to rely on the seasonal flood to do most of all the work. They had the shadoof to carry water and run it into irrigations and do other type things, but in main point they were doing that. And so was Egypt. And ironically, a lot of people don't realize this, but it has a different season. Egypt goes much later in the year, and of course hooked up to the Nile running the other way. That's what helps cause that. But in the northern hemisphere, you have spring quite early, and then the floods that come out of that. But it happened later in Egypt, and so there was kind of a dual season type thing. Their spring was much later, almost September and type things, and so it helped out that effect. Let's just continue. When Enki distributed the destinies, he made Ishkur inspector of the cosmos, or the galaxy. So this is an astronomer in so many ways. In one litany, Ishkur is proclaimed again and again as the great radiant bull. Your name is heaven. And there is Golgotha as the great bull in heaven, and it goes with the Gilgamesh story and everything else, so you can see how this connects too. And also called a son of On, even though he would have been down in another run. So this is another way of looking at too. I'm the son of God, and then if he's from and working with a cosmos type effect, then he's hooked to that God. Talking about earlier how there were so few gods, and they always try to have this incest. Well, you can't have it any other way. You've only got so many people in a pantheon. That's not actual reality. It's a God thing, and gods can't breed with humans, so you pick the ones that hook up to the aspects. It makes sense. Try to do it yourself. It's what you would do. But he's also called the son of On, though, Lord of Kakara, twin brother of Enki. So this would be On's son in another form. Lord of abundance, Lord who rides the storm, and Lion of heaven, not Bull of heaven. at every time, and so you can still see this same connection off to it, and it has a connection to the sun itself, and a sun of rebirth, and can be a different name of the sun coming up in rebirth, kind of like Jesus' story is. In other texts, Adad Ishkur is sometimes the son of the moon god Nana, or Sin, and we talked about Sin and Sinai, and Ai is the epitaph of a mountain. Ia is of the land, so Tanzania is a land, but Sinai is a mountain or a hill. Adad's consorts, the moon god Nana Sin, they have this through Ningal, and brother of Utu Shamash, so the sun god himself at that time, and Inanna Ishtar. So through this union, they have Ishtar. He's also occasionally the son of Enlil. So there can be different aspects and pushed on any one, and it's not just totally down. And you actually can see that in some of the Greek stories, where sometimes they say he comes from this, and some it tells this. This also shows you the pantheon has such a length of time, and because other things change in aspects about it, they kind of change the lineage to go more with it, because aspects of certain gods change just a little bit, and their control and what they do and things along that nature, right? Now, Adad, or Ishkur's consort, both in early Sumerian and later Assyrian text, was Shala, a goddess of grains, who was sometimes associated with the god Dagon. You could say that she's hooked up to like Ceres of the Greeks and such. She is also called Gubara in the earliest text, and that ironically has to do with metal making somehow, which doesn't make sense to give to her name whenever she is hooked up to fire and goddess of grain. So the fire god Gibel, though, named Gera in Akkadian, is sometimes also listed as the son of Ishkur and Shala. Adad, or Ishkur's special animal, is the bull. He is naturally identified with the Anatolian storm god Teshub. So there's the connections of storm gods and things. And Adad Ishkur's is identified with the god Amoru, the god of the Amorites. And now we again have the same situation going on in another place. And people don't want to make these connections, but a lot of scholars have, a long time ago, and they're still compiling to this day. The Babylonian center of Adad Ishkur's cult was the Karkara in the south, his chief temple being the Karkara. His spouse Shala was also worshipped in a temple named Durku. But among the Assyrians, his cult was especially developed along with his warrior aspect. From the reign of Tilgath-Pileser in 1115 to 10,000 or to 1077 BC, Adad had a double sanctuary in Ashur, which he shared with Anu. And they have different temples, as I talked about, and there's a major god to each major city-state, kind of, but then there are other gods that are in play. And so they don't have all 12 gods at every place. It's not to work like that. But major gods over major cities, and sometimes things change over time too. And also the ruling of the area changes from time to time, and that's when you see the pivot happen. Adad, his name is often associated with Adad in invocations and together with it, and working together symbiotically with each other, as to say, and this one, and in a way, invoking and saying, and this came before, and this came before. And a lot of people have seen this to realize that this means that they know of the earliest first lineage and the way they looked at it and the way they look at it the second lineage. And because of that, and not giving anything up, they're going to recant all versions of it, right? In their sacred invocations and things. The name Adad in various alternate forms and by names, such as Dadu, the Beer, and Dada, are often found the names of Assyrian kings. And I think we know what Dada and things sounds like to us, and father, and so on. And so this works well with the language too, and the concept, not far off. Adad Ishkur presents two aspects in the hymns, incantations, and votive inscriptions. On the one hand, he is the God who, through bringing on the rain in due season, causes the land to become fertile. And on the other hand, he brings out the storms that bring havoc and destruction, and perhaps floods and stuff too. He is pictured on monuments and cylinder seals, sometimes with a horn helmet, with a lightning and thunderbolt, and sometimes it's in the form of a spear. But then again, Baal himself sometimes is shown as being a spear, and as opposed to, and other forms of him show it to be an arrow, where he has a bow and arrow that lances these things. Other, it's a handheld, just lightning thing, and other ones it shows that lightning is a spear. When he casts his spear, it turns to lightning, zow, and then zaps, right? We're well familiar with this. And in the hymns, the somber aspects of the god on the whole predominate, and he's not necessarily looked at as being constantly destructive, but very rarely. And same thing with storms, and the idea that, well, mostly that's all right, but there can sure be a bad storm, but that isn't his normal aspect, right? His association with the sun god Shamash, due to the natural combination of the two deities who alternate in control of nature, leads to embodying him with some of the traits belonging to a solar deity. And now we have connections back to the sun, of course, and you can see that possibly, but also in the fact of a yin and yang. For a storm blocks the sun out and day happens, so he steps in front of God and does this thing. Some aspects say that it's because of him and he sends him out, so that's in front of him. You know, there's a lot of odd aspects to this, but Shamash and Adad become in combination of the gods of oracle and of divination in general. Whether to the will of the gods is determined through the inspection of liver, like they used to do, of the sacrificial animals, through observing the action of oil bubbles in a basin of water, and I've talked about that before a couple of times, and how they drip oil into it, and you can see in oil and water and how it looks. And dripping in that oil in the basin of water and relating it to the sky and the heavenly bodies that are there. And you can see how the Milky Way almost looks like a bunch of spit and bubbles and stuff, and a string along type of thing, or other bodily fluids, if you must, that they talked about at the time. It is Shamash and Adad who, in the ritual connected with divination, are invariably invoked every time. Similarly, in the annals of votive inscriptions of the kings, when oracles are referred to, Shamash and Adad are always named as the gods addressed, and their ordinary designation in such instances is Bele Biri, or lords of divination. And I've showed in a couple of my older videos, but whenever they start off invocations, and even early Hebrew did this same type of thing, where they talked about the sun, the moon, and the stars. And so what is that? Well, that's written down as that, but whenever they invoked it, they're calling upon each god independently, in order somewhat, and then speaking after that. It's part of the magic, or part of what makes it happen, or connects to God. So Hadad is a northwest Semitic storm and rain god, cognate in name and origin with the earlier attested East Semitic, Akkadian, or Assyrian Babylonian god Adad. And yeah, Adad, Hadad, it was pretty easy to see, especially whenever he has the exact same aspects and the thunderstorms and all that. Hadad was also called Pedar, which is Pitar and father. Rapu, Baal Zephon, and these names that come up from the Bible are often simply just Baal, Lord. His title is also used for other gods sometimes whenever they say just it's Lord, but he is the ruler of. The bull was the symbolic animal of Hadad. He appeared bearded, often holding a club and a thunderbolt while wearing a bullhorn headdress. Hadad was equated with the Anatolian storm god Teshub, with the Egyptian god Set, with the Greek god Zeus, with the Roman god Jupiter, as Jupiter Dolikinus, and the living god, currently Hadad. The Baal cycle, being a little bit different and connected to this, is a Ugaritic style and cycle of stories about the Canaanite god Baal, also known as Hadad, Baal Hadad, and the storm god of fertility. They are written in Ugaritic language and in a cuneiform alphabet, which only connects really to Sumerians, these people in Anatolia, a few of them, and Egypt. On a series of clay tablets they found in the 1920s in the Tell of Ugarit, modern-day Ras Shamra, and I've shown and talked about it a few times even in this series about the Yale dissertation that's done on comparative religion and how she talks about this connection, and she makes the connections of gods and does a very good job of it too. Situated on the Mediterranean coast of northern Syria, a few kilometers north of the modern-day city of Lataka, far ahead of the now known coast. The Baal cycle is fragmentary and leaves much unexplained that would have been obvious to a contemporary. So in other words, the people there would have easily known what this is all about, but now it's hard to look back at it, especially because it was tried to be covered up so much. And in another way, because we currently have such a belief system that's drawn into us that when we look at things like this as pagan, we try to see it in a different light instead of that exact same illumination of the same people and the same stories. In the earliest extant sections, there appears to be some sort of feud between El and Baal, father and son, actually. El makes one of his sons, who is called both Prince Yam, which is the sea, and Judge Nahar, which is the river, king over gods, and changes Yam's name from YW, Yah, so spelled at that time in the point in the text, to Mid-El, almost like middle, and Il is hooked up to gods, and it's why we gods and bringer of light, and it's how we have illumination. Il and Ilu is ancient gods, and Mid-El would come across as meaning the darling of El, but then right here we're talking about Mid-El, earth too, in the Mediterranean. And what's Terra? Terra is the name of the land, but it's also the name of Abraham's wife. And see, that shows you this thing where these people are actually portraying the parts of gods whenever they try to put it in the Bible, if anybody's ever caught that. And Terra, so what is terrain? Well, that's earth. In fact, the name earth itself kind of comes from and Urta, like Nin Urta, and it's where we get that concept of idea of the earth. Earth is that cur, though, that they talk about in there. El informs Yam that in order to secure his power, Yam will have to drive Baal from his throne. And this is almost the same type of thing they talk about in Egypt, where there's the day of Horus and Set follows him, and then they go around the underworld and come back up all brand new, and a new day. In this battle, Baal is somehow weakened, but the divine craftsman Kathar Wakasis strikes Yam with 2 magic clubs, and Yam collapses, and then Baal finishes the fight. Athart proclaims Baal's victory in statues, Baal Hadad as Ikirpt Ript, which comes out to being rider on the clouds or rider on the storm, a phrase applied to editors of the modern English Bibles to Yahweh in Psalm 68:4, at Othgar's urging, Baal scatters Yam and proclaims that Yam is dead and heat is assured. And this again shows you with this heat assured concept at the end of it, that it has to do with the sun rising again and coming back in through summer and not going to a winter time, and then somehow that the water controlled what became winter, and if they could get control of water, i.e. ice and the things that happen, that they could keep this under control in a way. A later passage refers to Baal's victory over Lotan. It's the many-headed sea dragon we've been talking about, and Leviathan. Due to gaps in the text, though, it's not known whether Lotan is another name for Yam or a reference to another similar story, or if in fact what actually is happening here is calling forth the Kraken. In the Mediterranean area, crops were often threatened by winds, storms, and floods from the sea, as well as the whole Fertile Crescent and any river valley that there is, indicating why the ancients feared the fury of this cosmic being. A palace is built for Baal-hadad with cedars from Mount Lebanon and Sirion, and also from silver and gold and lapis lazuli and things. In his new palace, Baal hosts a great feast for the other gods. When urged by Cathar Wakesis, Baal somewhat reluctantly opens a window in his palace and sends forth thunder and lightning. He then invites Mot, or the god of death, and drought and underworld, who is another son of El, to the feast. But Mot is insulted, for he eats human flesh, and the end of lives, death, and decay, and is presented as having to do such. And by the eater of human flesh and blood, he will not be satisfied with bread and wine. This is a strange story that actually goes with this Bible and this cannibalistic idea of Jesus, and how his body is the bread and the wine, and that is his body, and this is his blood. And I'll go into that a little bit further later. But Mot threatens to break Baal into pieces and swallow Baal. Now here we have a same type story of Osiris and things like that, and even Baal cannot stand up against death, though. And this is another type of story relating to like Gilgamesh, and realizing that no one is immortal. In fact, the gods die, but they get rebirthed. And it's a story about what rebirth is supposed to happen to us. So gaps here make the interpretation dubious, but it seems by the advice of the goddess Sapsha, or the sun, Baal has intercourse with a heifer cow and dresses the reluctant calf in his own clothes as a gift to Mot, and then himself prepares to go down into the underworld in the guise of a helpless shade. And this makes no sense to most people that read it, but whenever you find that in the Bible, in the ancient ways, nobody does this anymore, but they would make a scapegoat, and they would take all the sins of the people and things for the year before they make a brand new year, and put all the sins on the scapegoat. If you read into the story, it actually was two of them. One was for Azazel, a creature in the woods and stuff, and it shows you that back, even whenever they describe it then, there were not just one god they were praying to, but to other entities. For you had to appease certain aspects of other entities to do things, and if you left one alone, you were surely going to get screwed in some way. And so that's why it was real hard to go into a monotheistic type way, because even though you have Zeus controlling everything, everybody else does these certain aspects. It's not just all like they're robots and God tells them what to do, like we believe the Bible says today, right? But there are aspects that are working down to this. Now, news of Baal's apparent death leads to even El to mourn in the story, and Anat, Baal's sister, for Anatolia, finds Baal's corpse, and presumably the real body of the dead calf. And she buries the body with a funeral feast. And this is seen while we have an Apis bull, and how that represents some person, and that represents some type of God and rebirth and going. And it was supposed to have been to appease him. So also you can see the idea of that I don't have to be sacrificed. I give forth an animal to be sacrificed instead of humans. even back at Sinai, if you'll read close and keep going on past the Ten Commandments and so on, it talks that there is human sacrifice goes on. And all through this time. It's part of that Dungeon and Dragon things, and then there's a woman and she's chained up and the Kraken's going to come and get her and Perseus comes and save her. What's up with that woman? What's she being sacrificed? She's being sacrificed to one of these gods of the seas so they don't have the storms. So on like that. And it went on, people. And I'll go into it in some other videos too, but the god Athor is appointed to take Baal's place after, but he is a poor substitute. Meanwhile, Anat finds Mot, and she kills him, so this is where she becomes a warrior goddess and shows her prowess. Cleaves him with a sword, burns him with fire, and throws his remains in the field for the birds to eat. But the earth is still cracked and drought until Shapsh fetches Baal back. So the Baal has to come back, and the sun has to re-rise, and the thing has to happen again. And this is just a cycle of days. But you can imagine this somehow being told to children as a bedtime story, perhaps, and stuff. And boy, didn't they have some gruesome bedtime stories. But then again, you look at all Grimm's fairy tales and things, and that's not the greatest thing to send a kid to bed with either. But hey, I realized kind of when I was a kid, and I told my kids, that nightmares and stuff are just your brain trying to figure out that if I ever ran into that situation, what would I do? And I know it scares you, but I told her there are no, weird monsters anymore like D&D and all these things. We figured out what they were and what they're talking about, and even Behemoth in the Bible and all this type of stuff. And there are only bad men now in the world, and we still call them monsters, and they understand that concept. 7 years later, Mot returns and attacks Baal in a battle which ceases only when Shapsh tells Mot that El now supports Baal. Thereupon, Mot at once surrenders to Baal-Hadad and recognizes Baal as king. And this is a weird thing, too. People have made a lot out of this, where death is the controller of things. And you look at the religions and how it's all geared on death to do everything prepared for the afterlife and all this type of thing. And it had definite control and sway over these people in a hard way. And you look at Egypt and how dedicated they are to a death cult. And people now talking about Armageddon and things and the end of days and stuff like that, and they're waiting for it as a death cult. So you can kind of see how that had a lot of power over it, but then the other one was the god of light, of wisdom and everything. And it's not just all decay, for it comes again, for there will be another tomorrow. For tomorrow rises again. What happened yesterday? Fuck it. It doesn't matter. What happens today now happens today. Make up for it. Do whatever you got to do, but it's another day. The sun rises. Right? In religious texts, Baal-Hadad is the Lord of Sky, who governs the rain, and thus is the germination of plants, which has the power and desire to fertilize the world. He is the protector of life and growth to the agricultural people of the region. The absence of Baal dries the earth. Dry spells, starvation, and death and chaos is like an absence of Baal. And also refers to a mountain of the west wind. And this again relates to the idea of Dumuzi, which is much older in the Sumerians, and how he brings forth spring and these things and these ideas. But you're not worshiping Baal good enough, apparently, if you go through a drought. And this area is going to go through drought. And you wouldn't believe the stories I could tell you that I found out of what people did to appease gods in a land going through drought and slowly turning to desert area here in hopes of rain to help save them all. Because if it doesn't start raining soon, incredibly drastic things have to be done for people to survive. It's not something we think about in a modern day, but if we get screwed over by another comet or meteor attack that really hits hard and does something to us, we'll be put right back in the situation. And I also keep talking about how we're due to go into another ice age. A little overdue if you look at the edging of the map and the idea. And whenever things like that happen, this world is going to change, and people are going to go a lot more into the center and equator of the world, and everything's going to change quite a bit. And instead of all this global warming freak out, we need to look at that too. For every pulse that you see going into it before, he reaches a peak and then it bow. And you look at the way we're doing compared wise, and it's not the same quite, but it's due a bow and a drop, and it drops rapidly. This is not something that happens over thousands of years, but it happens inside of decades. It's all the way down to that point. Anyhow, guys, like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you've enjoyed and stayed with me through this. I know it's kind of monotonous and things, and you can imagine researching it and how monotonous it is, but I hopefully through this have shown you a lot of connections. And this is just ancient storm gods. I could do the same thing with Inanna and Venus and everything, pass it all the way through. You all can probably realize that. And there's so many other gods that you can ride through too, of Mot, the god of death, who's in Egypt and then here in this area. And certain ones overlap, even in their name and what they do. And you can tell connections that there are in certain places. Yeah. Quite interesting. And we're on to a news story. I appreciate y'all for joining me. Y'all have a good day. Peace.